Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror. I'm doing a library tour of all of my Stephen King books and I'm going to attempt to rank them. Now, I've got 48 books to show you today. I've just counted them all. I'm going to start with two caveats. So the first one is, well, fairly obviously, I haven't got all of his books. The notable omissions, as in the books that, like racking my brains, I really liked of his that I don't have copies of, are The Drawing of the Three, which I think is is it the second Dark Tower book or the third Dark Tower book, which I liked a lot, and Cujo. I've got a Kindle copy of, but I don't have a paper copy of. So those two I like a lot. And don't have either. Also, so second caveat is 6 of the books, these 6 I haven't read. So I'm going to go through these quickly and show them to you. But these are ones that either I've started and DNF'd or just haven't got to yet. So starting with books 5 and 6 of the Dark Tower series. So book 7 I don't have at all. So I've read the first 4 books of the Dark Tower series more than once. I did a while ago start doing this ridiculous extended read through of the Dark Tower series that's got tons of his other books in it, as well as the 6 or 7, is it 7 Dark Tower books. So it ended up being like well over 30 books in total. And I got, I think, a bit over a third of the way through that. And then gave up because it was just ridiculous. But I will finish the Dark Tower series at some point. So I've got book 5, The Wolves of Calla. Sorry, Wolves of the Calla. God, I'm not even getting the titles right. And book 6, Song of Susannah. I think the Dark Tower, and I'll probably come back to this theme later on. I think the Dark Tower feels like King being a bit self-indulgent and a bit experimental. And I think sometimes when he does that, it works really well. And other times when he does that, it doesn't work so well. I think the Dark Tower is kind of middling. It's him trying to do something a bit different. Clearly it's a labour of love because he's been doing it, I can't remember when the Gunslinger came out in the 80s, I think, didn't it? So, he's been doing it a while. So he clearly, is very invested in it. I think a lot of people, anecdotally from what I hear, were quite disappointed with the end of the series. So I'll see what I make of it when I get to it. But I think it's, more successful than some of his experiments and less successful than others. Right, moving on then. So also got this Black House by Mr. King and Peter Straub. So I've read The Talisman 2 or 3 times and read it fairly recently as part of that Dark Tower read through. And really, really enjoyed it, I have to say. So I'm quite looking forward to seeing what the sequel is like at some point. But it's a bit of a chunker, not quite a mammoth, or is it? Oh yeah, it's just a mammoth. It's just over 800 pages. Next up, Doctor Sleep. So big fan of The Shining. I did start Doctor Sleep, so I got it out of the library when it first came out, and didn't get that far with it for whatever reason. I don't know, I just didn't get on with it at the time. So we'll definitely go back and read this at some point. And might even watch the movie as well, which I think is on Amazon Prime at the moment. And then 2 others, which I started and DNF'd. So Duma Key, which I just didn't get on with it. It felt to me when I was reading it like it was just King, again, being a bit indulgent and just writing too many words, which is a common fault of his. But yeah, do need to read it at some point. And Lizzie's story, was it Lisey? I don't know. Her story anyway, which again I started but didn't get very far with. So again, at some point I will pick that up again and read it all the way through. Right, I'm going to have a sip of coffee and then start bringing the other books up. Okay, so I have arranged my King books into 4 piles. Those 4 piles being loved, really liked, thought they were okay, didn't like them or just don't remember them at all. And what I'm going to do is go through those piles from worst to best. What I would say is, some of these books I read a very long time ago. like when they came out and I was in my teens, so you know, kind of 25, 30 years ago. So my memory of all of them is not great, and that has informed, you know, this ranking process to an extent, in that if I don't remember the book at all, but I know I've read it, I'm guessing it wasn't great. So yeah, we'll go through and let's see. We're going to start with my least favourite Stephen King book, which I definitely remember because it's a new one. It was Later, which I read in the last few months. Yeah, I thought this was a terrible book. I really liked the cover, but I thought the book was awful. So I thought it was really derivative. It's about a kid who can see dead people. Does that ring any bells? It's got this weird, I won't go into what it is in case you haven't read it, but it's got a very weird kind of twist at the end, which is a little bit uncomfortable, in a similar way to the way the end of It is a little bit uncomfortable. And yeah, it didn't grip me. I didn't get what he was trying to do with it, really. It was kind of fun, but not in any sort of memorable or enjoyable way, to be honest with you. So yeah, that is definitely my least favourite one. Next up, I think I'm going to go with Tommyknockers, which I believe is the book that he claims he doesn't remember writing. I barely remember reading it, but do remember not being impressed with it at all. So it's kind of an alien invasion type one, I believe. I do quite like the cheesy cover on this edition. I guess it's, I don't know, is it trying to be a kind of throwback to the 50s alien invasion type movies? Like Invaders from Mars or something like that? I don't know. But anyway, what I do remember of it, which isn't much, is not good. Next up, Cell. So I do need to reread this at some point, give it another chance, and I'll be interested to see how it's dated. But I remember reading it when it first came out and thinking it was like a bad B-movie rip-off of The Stand. So yeah, cell phones turning people evil. Yeah, I don't know. Didn't do it for me. Okay, next up. This one, I think I might have kind of enjoyed when I read it, but I don't remember it at all. I seem to remember it's kind of a crime story, and I think it's King trying to maybe be a bit like John Steinbeck or something like that. I think it's got a bit of Mice and Men vibe, but from what I remember, it was one of those ones that's kind of an experiment and a bit indulgent, and didn't really work. Next up, Bag of Bones, which I think took me 2 or 3 goes to read, and just felt slow and kind of dull, if I'm honest. Then we've got From a Buick 8, which I've definitely read, but I have no memory of at all. So I'm going to take that as meaning I didn't think it was that great. Yeah, I couldn't even tell you what it was about. I'm assuming it's got a car in it, but beyond that, don't know. You may think that my ranking system is unfair. You can think that. It's up to you. Right, Desperation. So I bought this and The Regulators, which was the book that was published at the same time, when they came out in hardback, both of them. This isn't my original copy, this is one I picked up secondhand a while ago. Again, it was an interesting experiment. So if you don't remember, they're interwoven stories. This one was published as Stephen King. The Regulators was published as Richard Bachman. They're interwoven stories, but they just, neither of them really works that well. It's King being kind of, you know, one of his grander, more, you know, broad scope kind of books, but yeah, it didn't really work for me. And then Hearts in Atlantis, which is one of his ones that's got 4 novellas in it, I believe. Yeah, one of which I reread as part of the Dark Tower read through, which was I think was Low Men in Yellow Coats, which was kind of fun. And I do remember Hearts, the story about someone who's addicted to this card game, being, you know, really quite enjoyable as well. But overall, as a kind of, I think it's halfway between a collection and a single book, in that the stories are supposed to kind of link into each other. But yeah, I didn't think it was great. Okay, so next up is the kind of meh pile. So the pile that I didn't hate, but I didn't love either. We'll start with Needful Things. So I think I was in the States when this came out in paperback, and for years I had an American paperback copy, which I kind of treasured just because it was an American paperback copy, and it was, you know, that was back in the day when it was difficult. You know, it was difficult to get such things in the UK, but it's not a great book, is it? I mean, it's huge. Was it 700 pages long? And I just remember it being much. I don't think it needed nearly 700 pages to tell the story, from what I remember. But some interesting concepts, and King's always quite fun when he does, you know, kind of small town America, which is definitely what this is about. Next, we've got Full Dark No Stars. Which is a kind of, I don't know, is it a short story collection or a novella collection? I think it's kind of novellas and short stories. I think there's only 5 things in it, and it's fine, it's okay, but I think his short fiction is best when it's short rather than novella length. Continuing that theme, If It Bleeds. So I really liked the Holly what's-her-face story in this. What's she called? Holly Gibney. I thought that was excellent, and I thought Rap was pretty good as well. This kind of story of obsession and writing was good. But then there's that weird one, The Life of Chuck. Does anyone remember that one? Which is just very bizarre, and I didn't think worked at all. So overall, this was a bit of a mixed bag for me. Next up, Insomnia, which I did quite like, albeit it's much longer than it needs to be. But I thought King, you know, kind of ruminating on old age and things like that, in this story of elderly people in a nursing home, from what I remember, was quite interesting, and I do really like that cover as well, actually. Okay, next up, Thinner, the first of the Bachman books that was republished as King. I guess the thing I would say about this is it's not hard to tell why he published it under a pseudonym. You know, it's not his best work. It's a short story, basically, that's padded out to make an almost 300-page novel. So it's kind of fun in an easy horror comics kind of a way, but definitely doesn't deserve to be as long as it is. And yeah, no surprise that he didn't publish it under his own name originally. Again, on the theme of books being longer than they need to be, Rose Madder, nearly 600 pages long, quite taut and gripping at times from what I remember. So the story of an abused woman on the run from her husband, who's somewhat monstrous, literally as well as figuratively. But yeah, didn't need to be 600 pages long. Would have been much better if it had been a shorter, tauter kind of a book. Next up, the first of the Gunslinger books, The Dark Tower. So this is, you know, going back to the King experimenting thing. I think it's an interesting experiment. I think some of the action scenes in this book in particular are fantastic, but it is a bit of a weird idea, and it does feel very self-indulgent. So, you know, interesting and fun at times, but not great. At least it's quite short though. Again, with the experiments, Eyes of the Dragon, his fantasy novel, which I believe he wrote for his kids. So this is fine. It's you know, as a fantasy novel, it's fine, but it's nothing, you know, it's nothing special. And I seem to remember the writing style of it is quite weird as well, in that it reads very much like a kind of Grimm's fairy tale. It's got a slightly disconnected prose style, which I think I didn't love, if I'm honest. Okay, next up, Firestarter, so one of his more famous ones. This one I've read a couple of times. It's a fun story. So the idea of a little girl who can, you know, set fires in the mind is great. It's fun, and I do enjoy the kind of late 70s, early 80s conspiracy theory type stuff of it. So all the bits about the girl's parents and the CIA experiment they were part of, and that kind of thing is quite interesting. But again, it's a lot longer than it needs to be, and it suffers from something that is in a few of King's books, which is a shall we say, misguided representation of non-white characters. So this one's got a kind of cliched wise old Native American, Indigenous American character in it, who just feels very, very dated and, you know, not brilliant, to be honest with you. Okay, next up, the Bachman books. So, you know, as with Thinner, these feel like books that, you know, would not have been published under the King name if it hadn't come out that he was Bachman. But they are quite fun. So you've got, what have you got in here? You've got Rage, which of course is now being withdrawn from sale. So I'm quite interested to reread that one, so about school shooting. And yeah, King has withdrawn it from sale nowadays. We've got The Long Walk, which I think he wrote when he was very, very young, which is a kind of a dystopian thing. Roadwork, which I don't remember at all. And The Running Man, which I remember from the film, but not from the book. So again, I will reread this at some time. At least there, you know, it's four books in a book that's about as thick as Insomnia. So at least he's being a bit briefer. And then different seasons. So again, as with the other collections I've talked about, I think this is a bit of a mixed bag. But that said, I think that The Body, which is the story that Stand By Me, the film, was based on, is a really lovely, moving, you know, and quite gripping story. And Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption is really good as well. The Breathing Method, which is the final story in the book, which is a shorter one, is a really good horror story. But Apt Pupil, I seem to remember, left me cold. So, you know, again, a bit of a mixed bag overall, but it has got some good stuff in it. Okay, so onto the liked but not loved section. So first up, The Green Mile. So I read this when it first came out in the way it was intended to be read, as in instalments. I remember very clearly going to it was a newsagents that had it in the town I grew up in, each month, and buying the new instalment when it came out, and that being a really quite a thrilling experience. I really like the idea of episodic fiction, and I think it's a shame, you know, there's not more done with it. I think Amazon were, I can't remember what they called it, but Amazon were going to experiment with an episodic thing on Kindle. I don't know if they ever actually did that or not, but I do like the idea of it. I enjoy a short read that you can, you know, sit down and read in one go, but then builds into something bigger. So whilst I'm not convinced, you know, this is his best work by any means, I do think it was an interesting experiment, to go back to my point about his experiments. I think this is one of his better experiments. It does suffer, as you know, as other books of his do, with having this kind of mystical African-American character in, which is a bit of a trope, but aside from that, you know, it's an okay read. Next up, Wisdom and Glass, book 4 of the Dark Tower books. So I've talked about book 1. I don't have copies of books 2 and 3. 3 is, I think, 2 is my favourite, drawing of the 3. But this one is good. So, you know, it's big and thick, but it's deservedly big and thick. It's got a real epic feel to it, and I think it works really well. Next up then, Mr. Mercedes, the first of the trilogy about, I've forgotten his name, Bill Hodges. So I think it's a really interesting trilogy. My favourite is Finders Keepers, which I don't have a copy of. I've got the first and third for some reason, but I haven't got Finders Keepers. I thought Finders Keepers was the best one, but it's a weird book because it's quite different from the other two books. It sits quite strangely in the trilogy. But again, I liked, as with Insomnia, I like King kind of reflecting on old age and things like that through the character of Bill Hodges. And I think it's, you know, this is a good book. It's not a great book. I think the other two books in the series are better. But it's a good start to the series anyway. Next up, another King mammoth, so Under the Dome. So I tried to read this 2 or 3 times, I think, before I finally managed it. And I finally managed it on holiday. So I was determined to read it, so I took it on holiday, so I just had to. Yeah, I like stories like this that take ordinary people and throw them into an extraordinary situation. So this one where, you know, a town is cut off from the outside world and society kind of disintegrates, I think is interesting and well done. It's, again, it's not his best work, but I do quite like him playing with those small town America themes, which he does, you know, is one of his talents, shall we say. I think this is a pretty good book. Next up, The Dead Zone. So similar to Firestarter, which I've already talked about, I like the kind of conspiracy theory, you know, kind of 70s paranoia kind of vibe that's in this. This is a terrible cover, isn't it? Really awful cover. This is a library edition that I picked up. I do hate that cover. But I do want to reread this. I remember it being good. I think the central concept of, you know, someone realising that the President of the United States is a nutter is a really strong concept, and probably you know, more relevant now than ever, or more relevant a few years ago than ever. So yeah, this is, I think, a really solid, taut, well written, tightly plotted thriller. Next up, Gerald's Game. So again, this feels a bit kind of experimental in that although I suppose it's a bit like Cujo in that it's, you know, got a very limited cast and a very tight scope, but I think a really, really good suspense novel. I thought the Netflix movie on it was excellent as well. So yeah, just really gripping. I suppose Misery, which is another one I don't have a copy of. Misery will be another one that I'd put in that same boat as this and Cujo. So I think King does that kind of very tight, focused suspense novel very well. So this is a good one. Next up, Skeleton Crew. So his second short story collection. Not my favourite. Night Shift I prefer. I think some of the stories in this are a bit patchy, but there are some really good ones as well. The Mist is in here, which is excellent. I think the Raft is quite fun as well. Oh, the Monkey is quite creepy too. And I think that's just a fantastic cover. I love that cover. So yeah, this is a good one. Not his best short story collection, but a very solid one. Next up, another more recent one. So Joyland. So I read this only very recently. In fact, I think it's probably the most recent Stephen King book I've read, and I really enjoyed it. It's got its flaws. So it mixes a kind of mystery with supernatural stuff. He seems to, quite often in his books, books that would have existed quite well without the supernatural element, he feels the need to throw some supernatural stuff in, and he does in this. But it is it's a very nostalgic novel, and again, it feels like, you know, King reflecting on his life. So it's an old guy looking back on his time as a young man working in an amusement park, and the shady goings on that happened there. So fantastic cover from Hard Case Crime as always. And a very enjoyable book. It felt a bit like having a warm hug from Stephen King, despite the fact there are some quite horrible bits in it. Okay, next up, The Stand. I've actually got 2 copies of The Stand because this one, as you can see, literally fell apart as I was reading it. It's just too big. It couldn't handle its own weight. So, you know, what can you say about The Stand? It's gargantuan. You know, 1,300 pages. It doesn't need to be that long. It's got, you know, this weird what King calls dark Christianity at its centre. It's got a mystical African American character again, which is, you know, a trope I don't buy into at all. But that said, it's such an ambitious work, and you know, the fact that he manages to pretty much pull it off, despite some, you know, some bits of it not being that great, other bits of it are fantastic, and overall I think it, you know, it stands up as a thoroughly decent end of the world novel. I do prefer Robert R. McCann's Swan Song, which I reviewed on the channel recently, but you know, this has to be in the kind of 4-star bucket for me just because of its ambition. Okay, the piles here in front of me are getting a bit big and tottery looking, so if you suddenly hear a massive crash, that's why. So next up, Revival. I think a lot of people don't like this book, but I thought it was really good. It's if you've not read it, and I think it's probably one of his less popular ones, it's about a young guy in typical King fashion, who gets involved with this like preacher, who ends up travelling around doing these, you know, kind of what do you call it? Like revivalist, clearly revival. These revivalist, you know, preacher shows, and it's got some really cool, weird horror towards the end, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think it left a lot of people scratching their heads. I did lend it to someone at work who was completely flummoxed by it, but I thought it was a really fun read. Okay, next up, so we are getting close to the end of the liked but not loved section, so soon we're going to be into the loved section. So The Outsider. So again, this is one I read fairly recently. it's a slightly strange book in that it feels very much like a book of two halves, and you've got the first half where this character has been accused of a horrible crime and it's all about him trying to trying to prove his innocence, and then the second half, which is about Holly Gibney from the Bill Hodges books, who gets involved trying to investigate what's going on, and it ends up, the first half is incredibly taut, like just incredible, and enjoyable and good, and the second half feels a bit like a not great episode of the X-Files. So it's definitely a mixed bag, but it is a good read, and I do love this cover as well. Okay, moving on, The Dark Half. I thought it was an interestingly introspective book. I do like King when he's writing about writing, and this one, which is about an author who's got a pseudonym and who tries to kill the pseudonym off, and then the pseudonym literally comes back to life and tries to kill him. I thought it was a really fun, taut chiller. So I do like The Dark Half, and I really like the starkness of this UK paperback as well. That's one I want to reread soon. And finally, in the Like But Not Love section, Salem's Lot. So again, I think this is a magnificent cover. I absolutely love this cover. The New English Library editions from around this time are just fantastic. I don't know who did the art on this. No, it doesn't say on the back, but an absolutely brilliant cover. For me, I think this is a good book. It's very readable, it's interesting, but I don't love it as much as some people do. It just doesn't quite hit the mark for me somehow, and I can't really explain why. But there's just something about it that stretches credibility a bit too much, I think. Just the idea that this vampire invades a small town and people kind of don't realise. So yeah, it's good, it's very readable, it's very exciting, it's quite chilling, but definitely not one of my favourites. Okay, if you made it this far, well done, you've got stamina. I will flash up a picture of what my desk looks like at the moment. It's quite scary and alarming, and I'm a bit worried I'm going to get covered in an avalanche of Stephen King books. But anyway, on to the loved pile. So this is the 6, 7, 8, 9, the top 9, not quite the top 10. So I guess Salem's Lot would have been top 10. This is the remainder of the top 10. So this is books I really, really, really liked / loved. So first up, 11/22/63. So I just thought it's kind of an obvious concept in terms of, and in fact Quantum Leap had done it, but someone going back in time to try and stop the Kennedy assassination. But I just thought it was really, really well executed, and some really memorable stuff in here as well. And I thought the central romance between the protagonist and the lady whose name I forget was just beautifully done, really moving, really good, really, really great book. I haven't got idea where to put it. I'll just put it on my lap. Right, next up, Dolores Claiborne. This is one I definitely need to reread because I don't think I've read it since it came out. But I remember devouring this in a weekend and thinking it was just a beautiful, beautiful book. So quite chilling, but just really gently written somehow, and just very, very gripping and enjoyable. I love the kind of simplicity. The simplicity of it, and the fact that it manages to really grip without being, without explosions going off every 5 minutes and that kind of thing. I thought it was a really good book. Back to Bill Hodges. So as I said, my favourite in this series is Finders Keepers, but I thought this one, End of Watch, the final book in the series, was really, really moving and brilliantly done. And again, as I said already, great to see King reflecting as he gets older on old age and things like that. So I thoroughly enjoyed End of Watch. Next up, a more recent one, and one I think a lot of people don't like so much, but I thought this was great, The Colorado Kid, which is basically a mystery novel, but a mystery novel without a solution. So about a body that appears on an island off the coast of Maine, and what I love about it is two things really. So one, it completely indulges King's love of that part of the world. And there's some wonderful dialogue in here between kind of old timers sitting around in the coffee shops and things like that. But also just his playfulness and him playing around with the very idea of a mystery novel. I thought it was beautifully done, and I loved it. And again, look at that cover from Hard Case Crime. Isn't that just gorgeous? Fantastic stuff. Right, the last few books are all earlier from his career and very well known ones, which is probably not a big surprise. But so Pet Sematary, so just, you know, chilling book, a fantastic book about the challenges and fears of being a parent, and yeah, just gripping and creepy and, you know, emotional and dark, and, you know, it feels like a very personal book, and a very good one. Next up, It. So, you know, again, it's massive. Again, it's, you know, 1,200 odd pages. It's longer than it needs to be. It's got that weird, dodgy ending, but, you know, it at the same time, it is a masterpiece of horror. It's got so many memorable scenes in it, and I have very fond memories of this book. So when this book came out, and I guess I was about 14, I remember being on holiday. There's a bit of a theme here with me reading King books on holiday. I read The Stand on holiday as well. Me being on holiday and having a hardback copy of it that I got out of the library, and just lying on the beach and devouring it, and, you know, sand in between the pages of this hardback copy. And I've read it probably 3 times since then. I think it's a great book. I love the interplay between present day and past. I just think it's, you know, for all its flaws, I think it's an excellent book. Okay, next up, Christine. So again, you know, this book is longer than it needs to be, nearly 600 pages, but it's the first Stephen King book I read. So I remember getting this, not this very book, but the same edition, out of my local library. So I'd started out on Lovecraft. Lovecraft was my gateway drug into horror. And then, you know, was looking in the library and had heard Stephen King, obviously, and found this and took it out. My dad insisted on flipping through it to make sure it wasn't completely unsuitable. I don't know how he missed the myriad uses of the C word in this book when he did that, or maybe he didn't miss them. He just didn't think it was a big deal. But yeah, it's like a lot of his books, it focuses on obsession, and it does it really well. Yeah, it's just a fun book, a chilling book, but, you know, most importantly for me, my first Stephen King book, which definitely means I rank it higher than I might do otherwise. Okay, speaking of firsts, next up, Carrie. So, you know the story of Carrie. It's just a great book, isn't it? It's again, really short for a King novel, but really tightly plotted, and it just draws on so many universal fears and anxieties and things like that. I think it works beautifully, and I think he does a great job of portraying a female character as well. Plus, you've got the, you know, demonic mother, which is interesting, and that fantastic ending. You know, so I think Carrie, you know, rightly launched King's career into the world of horror. I still think it stands up as a great book. Next up, Night Shift. Now, Night Shift, I think, might have been the first Stephen King book I bought. So Carrie was the first one I read, but I think I bought Night Shift from our local bookshop way back then in the 80s. And I think it's a fantastic collection. So, you know, there are stories in here that I still remember reading the first time. So yeah, a great collection, and I think King's short fiction is some of my favourite stuff of his. I think it's brilliant. Which leaves us with number 1. You can probably guess what it is, because it's right. I'm going to pause the video there, because when I was editing it, it occurred to me that really I should talk about the other, I think it's 14 Stephen King books that I've read that I don't own copies of at the moment. So what I'm going to do is go through those 14 now, and I'll do that in the same way, the same kind of grouping as I've done with the other books. So books I didn't really like at all, books that were a bit meh, books that I liked but didn't love, and then books that I loved. And then I will put up on screen the full top 58, which is the number that it comes to, and then I will reveal my number 1, which you can probably guess. Okay, right, let me go through these then. Okay, so first one, and this is, remember, first in order of badness. So the worst one, and I would rank this as the worst Stephen King book I've read, so worse than later, is Sleeping Beauties, which he co-wrote with his son Owen. I just thought it suffered from all the things his books tend to suffer from in terms of just being much too long, and just the whole concept I thought was flawed. So it's about a future where all the women in the world fall asleep, basically. So that's an interesting concept, but it just doesn't work as a book. I did not enjoy it. Okay, so moving on then into the books that were, okay. So first one, Cycle of the Werewolf. So this is a short story that was, padded out to be a book that could be sold in its own right, with some lovely illustrations by Bernie Wrightson, who's a fantastic illustrator, great comic book artist. So I think the illustrations are brilliant, and the book itself is it's a nice thing to have, and I would like to get another copy of it. But the actual werewolf story that the illustrations illustrate is not that great. Next book, The Regulators. So I've kind of talked about this already when I talked about Desperation. So this was the Richard Bachman half of that double billing, and it's okay. It's a bit of a mess, to be honest with you. It's a fun concept, but doesn't really work. Moving on then to one of his short story collections, so Everything's Eventual. So this is quite a thick short story collection. It's one of his longer ones, I think. And when I looked through the list of all the stories that were in it, there weren't any that leapt out as being really great ones. So that gets a middling ranking from me. Next up, 4 Past Midnight. So one of his collections of 4 novellas. So again, they're not all great. The Langoliers is fun, but just quite throwaway, really. The one I do really like in this collection is The Library Policeman, which is about someone whose job it is to, like a really tough, hard-boiled cop, whose job it is to get back overdue library books. So that was a fun one. Okay, we are now into Liked But Not Loved. So we've got The Drawing of the Three and The Wastelands, the second and third Dark Tower books. So I think both of these are really fun, and I particularly like The Drawing of the Three. There's something about the back and forth between the world of the Gunslinger and our world that I think works really well in that book. I think it's a very enjoyable read. And The Wastelands, where they're on the crazy train journey, is a lot of fun as well. Next up, another collaboration, so Gwendy's Button Box, which he wrote with Richard Jidmar, I think that's how you pronounce his name. I thought this was fun. So it's a shorter one. It's got a great concept, which is that this girl has this box that she can basically change the events that are happening in the world with. It's a good concept and well executed, and not too long as well. So I don't know if it was the collaboration element that meant that King reined in his tendency to be overly verbose, but I think that one works really well. Next up, Cujo. So I kind of reflected on this a bit when I was talking about Gerald's Game of Misery. So one of those really tight suspense novels that he does so well. I think it's a really gripping and interesting book. And next up, Venus, you are not supposed to be in this video. Get down. Next up, so in a similar vein, Misery. So a great book, perfect length, really gripping, really chilling, great characters. So Annie is a fantastic villain. So a really good book, and a great movie as well. So one of those ones where, and I think my theory of what makes a good King movie is the best King movies are the ones that are based on the shorter books. So the shorter the book is, the more likely the film is to be good, is my rule of thumb for Stephen King movies. Okay, next up then, The Talisman. So I talked a little bit about Black House at the start. So The Talisman I really like. So a gripping and enjoyable kind of fantasy adventure. It's quite, feels like a bit of a throwback at times to kind of Saturday morning pictures and things like that. I think it's a really fun book. Okay, another short story collection next. So Nightmares and Dreamscapes. So again, this is quite a thick short story collection, but I think it's quite a strong one. In particular, in this, there's a Sherlock Holmes story which I really enjoyed, and there's a Cthulhu Mythos story which I thought was really good as well. Okay, so next, Just After Sunset. So another short story collection. And as I said when I was talking about Night Shift, I really like King's short fiction. I think it's one of his strengths. I think he does that kind of tight, classic horror style story really well, and he's very good at immersing you very quickly in the world that he's talking about in the story without, you know, going into great detail about it. So yeah, Just After Sunset, I particularly like Rest Stop and A Very Tight Place and The Cat from Hell in this one. So a strong collection. And again, so next book up, another short story collection, so Bizarre Bad Dreams, which again I thought was a really good one. So it's got in it, which is his kind of take on the Kindle, which is interesting, and Blockade Billy, which I really liked as well. So following on from mention of Blockade Billy, so another bit of baseball. So baseball's weird because I've been to one baseball game. So when I was in the States years ago, I went to a baseball game, but I only really know about it through popular culture, and probably particularly through Stephen King. So obviously, you know, there's lots of baseball movies like Field of Dreams and things like that, which, you know, give you, as someone who doesn't live in a country, as most of us don't, where baseball is played, it's a fascinating part of American culture, I think, for non-American people, because we kind of don't really get it, but we know it's really important. So yeah, so anyway, I'm rambling on a bit. So next up then, so The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, which I thought was, I like King when he's being kind of sweet and nostalgic. I thought that was a good book. And then finally, in the loved section, and I have mentioned this already, so Finders Keepers, the middle of the Bill Hodges books. I thought this was brilliant, and it, as I've said already, it veers completely away from the rest of the series. But I really liked the idea, like the central concept of it, about this lost book. I really liked, I like King when he's writing about writing. I think he has a lot of interesting stuff to say about that. So yeah, that's definitely one that I loved. So that was my wrap up of the books I don't own physical copies of. I am now going to flash up my top 58 on the screen from 58 down to 1, and then I'll talk about my number 1 book. So number 1 is The Shining. Now I could have sworn I had a New English Library copy in the, you know, with the same typeface and or same, you know, cover font and art style as this of The Shining, but clearly I haven't. I've got this much newer edition, which is kind of fun. At least they've borrowed the font for his name. But not as great as that old New English Library paperback that I used to have, which was probably the second Stephen King book I bought after Night Shift. I just think The Shining is a fantastic achievement. So, you know, an incredibly personal novel in what he says about writing in it and what he says about alcoholism, you know, him having had his own struggles with addiction. Fantastically taught. You know, I love books that, you know, it's a bit of a trope, I suppose, but books that trap their characters and then, you know, inflict complete horror upon them. So I think the setting of the hotel in this is brilliant. I think it's quite a subtle book despite all the horror, and just, you know, just a brilliant book. So definitely my favourite Stephen King book. There are times in my life when I would have said it's my favourite book. I don't think I'd say that anymore. Again, it suffers from that you know, mystical African-American trope, but it is a bloody good book, and definitely still one of my favourite novels, if not my favourite anymore. So I've shown you 48 Stephen King books. I hope you enjoyed that. I've got no idea how long I've been recording for. Do let me know in the comments what you thought of my selection. I'm sure you will. Let me know what your favourite Stephen King book is. And as always, I hope you're safe and well, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Cheerio.